In 1971, a graphic design student was paid $35 to create a logo for a small broke shoe company that most people had never heard of. She sketched a simple curved shape in a few hours, handed it over, and got paid barely enough to cover a used couch. That logo is now worth more than the entire economy of some countries. The man who paid her those $35 wasn't rich yet either. He was, at that exact point, one bad month away from losing the company entirely, for roughly the fourth time in a decade. His name was Phil Knight. The company was Nike, and almost nobody talks about how many times it should have died before that logo ever meant anything. This isn't a story about a genius with a big idea. Phil Knight has said many times, in his own words, that he never felt like he knew what he was doing. This is a story about what it actually looks like to keep moving forward through years of chaos, debt, and doubt, long after any reasonable person would have quit. It starts in 1962 with a business school paper. Knight was getting his MBA at Stanford, and for one assignment, he wrote about an idea that seemed almost absurd at the time, that cheap, high-quality Japanese running shoes could disrupt an athletic shoe market completely dominated by German brands like Adidas and Puma. It was just a paper, a theoretical exercise for a grade. But Knight had been a middle-distance runner at the University of Oregon, and the idea stuck with him in a way most class assignments never do. After graduating, instead of filing that paper away like every other classmate did with theirs, Knight actually got on a plane to Japan. He walked into the offices of a shoe manufacturer called Onitsuka Tiger, and when they asked which company he represented, he gave them a name on the spot that didn't technically exist yet: Blue Ribbon Sports. There was no office. There was no staff. There was, at that point, barely a business plan. There was a 24-year-old American making up a company name in real time because he refused to let the meeting end in a no. That instinct to answer a closed door with an improvised answer instead of walking away shows up again and again throughout his entire career, and it's the first real clue to how his mind actually worked. He wasn't reckless. He was someone who treated uncertainty as something to talk his way through, not something to wait out. He came home with a small shipment of sample shoes and turned to the one person he trusted completely to help sell them: his old college track coach, Bill Bowerman. Bowerman wasn't just a mentor. He was an obsessive tinkerer who had spent years experimenting with lighter, better shoe designs for his own runners, taking apart shoes and rebuilding them by hand in his garage, trying to shave fractions of an ounce off every pair. Knight offered him a partnership. Bowerman put in $500. That $500 and a trunk full of shoes was the entire founding capital of what would eventually become Nike. For years, this wasn't a business in any way that looked impressive from the outside. Knight sold shoes out of the back of a green Plymouth Valiant, driving from track meet to track meet up and down the West Coast, setting up a small table, talking to coaches and runners directly, one relationship at a time. He kept his day job as an accountant because Blue Ribbon Sports didn't come close to paying enough to live on. He was, by every conventional measure, an unremarkable young accountant with an unusual side hustle that mostly lost money. What almost nobody knew at the time was how close that side hustle came to collapsing, over and over again, for nearly a decade straight. Blue Ribbon Sports grew, slowly, but growth without cash is its own kind of danger. Every time orders increased, Knight needed more money up front to pay the Japanese factory before the shoes even shipped, long before he collected payment from the stores selling them. He was perpetually short on cash, constantly negotiating with banks that were constantly threatening to pull his line of credit. More than once, his bank essentially told him they no longer wanted his business, that he had grown too fast, borrowed too aggressively, and looked, on paper, like an obvious risk they didn't want to carry anymore. Most people don't know this part of the story because it doesn't fit neatly into the version where a founder has a brilliant idea and money simply follows. For most of the 1960s and 1970s, Phil Knight ran a company that was constantly, technically, one bank decision away from not existing anymore. He later admitted in his own memoir that there were entire years where he genuinely didn't know if the company would survive the next quarter. Not metaphorically, literally uncertain whether there would be a next quarter. Here's the part of the mindset that actually explains the outcome. More than any single flash of genius, Knight kept operating at the edge of what the business could technically support again and again, on purpose. Every time he had a little breathing room, he used it to place a bigger order, take a bigger risk, expand into one more market, instead of playing it safe and consolidating what he already had. That's an incredibly uncomfortable way to run anything for over a decade. It's also, very specifically, the only way a company with almost no capital manages to grow at all in an industry dominated by giants with 100 years of head start. In 1971, the partnership with the Japanese manufacturer started falling apart as Onitsuka Tiger began exploring other American distributors behind Knight's back, sensing they no longer needed the small company that had built their entire U.S. market for them. Rather than fight to save a crumbling relationship, Knight made the harder call. He decided to build his own brand from scratch, with his own name, his own logo, his own factories, starting essentially from zero, at the exact moment his biggest supplier relationship was collapsing underneath him. That's where the name Nike came from, suggested in a late-night brainstorm by one of his first employees, Jeff Johnson, who said it came to him in a dream, referencing the Greek goddess of victory. Knight has said publicly he didn't love the name at first. He went with it anyway, mostly because they were out of time and needed something printed on the shoes before a shipping deadline. And that same week, that same design student sketched the swoosh for $35 because there was no time and no budget for anything more elaborate. The first several years under the Nike name were arguably even more precarious than the Blue Ribbon sports years, because now there was no Japanese factory relationship to fall back on if anything went wrong, and everything, constantly, went wrong. Quality control problems. Cash flow crunches so severe that Knight has described personally negotiating with suppliers just to keep shipments moving another month. An SEC investigation years later into how the company had financed some of its early growth, which nearly derailed everything all over again, right as the company was finally becoming a household name. Through all of it, one belief seems to have carried Knight forward more than any strategy: the idea that constant instability was simply the cost of admission, not a sign something had gone wrong. Most people treat financial panic as a reason to slow down. Knight treated it as the normal background noise of building anything real. The turning point that finally gave the company cultural weight wasn't a marketing campaign. It was Bowerman's obsessive tinkering. One morning, he poured rubber into his wife's waffle iron, experimenting with a new tread pattern. It ruined the iron. It also became the basis for the Nike Waffle Trainer, one of the shoes that defined the 1970s running boom. Around that time, Nike found its first real cultural ambassador in Steve Prefontaine, a fiercely competitive young runner out of Oregon who spoke his mind without filter and gave the company something no ad budget could buy: a personality people actually wanted to watch. When he died suddenly in a car accident in 1975, at 24, it was a devastating loss. But the identity he'd shaped for the brand, rebellious, relentless, allergic to playing it safe, stuck permanently. By 1980, after roughly 18 years of financial near-death experiences, Nike went public. Knight, the accountant who once sold shoes out of the trunk of his car, became a billionaire on paper, from a company he'd personally kept afloat through more brushes with bankruptcy than he could apparently count by the time he wrote his memoir. What makes Knight's mindset worth studying isn't unshakable confidence. He's been unusually honest about the opposite, describing feeling like an imposter for most of his career, unsure if the next crisis would be the one that ended everything. Most founders polish that doubt out of their story after the fact. Knight left it in because the doubt was never actually the obstacle. It ran the entire time, right alongside every decision that built the company. The mindset was never about eliminating fear. It was about making the next move anyway, underfunded and unsure, for the better part of 2 decades, until the odds finally turned. That's the part of this story that applies far beyond shoes or business. Almost nobody who succeeds at something difficult does it by first becoming certain. They tolerate a genuinely uncomfortable amount of uncertainty for far longer than feels reasonable. Knight simply outlasted his own doubt, one chaotic, nearly bankrupt year at a time, until a waffle iron, a dead runner's legacy, and a $35 logo quietly became one of the most recognized symbols on the planet. Even after the IPO, that appetite for risk didn't disappear. It just found bigger stakes. By the early 1980s, Nike was losing ground to Reebok and the aerobics boom. Instead of playing it safe, Knight approved one of the riskiest bets in the company's history, signing an unproven rookie basketball player in 1984 to a shoe deal built around a design that violated NBA uniform rules so blatantly the league threatened to fine him every time he wore them. That rookie was Michael Jordan. Nike paid the fines. Air Jordans became the most talked about sneaker launch in history and repositioned Nike as the boldest brand in sports right when it needed that most. A few years later, the company was still searching for a way to express what it stood for. The phrase that became the most famous 3 words in advertising history came from an unexpectedly dark place, the reported last words of a man facing execution in Utah in 1977, who simply said, "Let's do it." An ad executive reworked it for a sneaker campaign years later, and Knight, by his own admission, didn't even like it much at first. He approved it anyway, the same way he'd once accepted a name he wasn't sure about and a logo he'd paid $35 for, because there wasn't time to wait for something he loved more. It became the most recognized slogan in advertising history, describing, almost by accident, the exact mindset that had kept his company alive for 2 decades before anyone had heard those 3 words together. Decades later, Knight wrote a memoir called Shoe Dog, and what stands out most isn't the celebration of victory. It's how much space he gives to describing exactly how afraid and unsure he was at nearly every stage. He wrote about lying awake, doing anxious math on how many days of payroll the company had left. He never rewrote that fear out of the story to look more confident in hindsight, which is rare enough among founders to be worth noticing. Go back to that design student and her $35. She wasn't underpaid because Knight didn't value good design. She was paid that little because there genuinely wasn't more to give, from a company that had no idea if it would exist to pay anyone a year later. Every symbol of Nike's eventual dominance, the rushed name, the cheap logo, the borrowed slogan, the ruined waffle iron, came out of scarcity, not confidence. Knight didn't build an empire by waiting until he felt ready. He built it by moving forward for nearly 2 decades before he ever had the right to feel ready at all.